Welcome to a CheckMate analysis by InsMark, showing you a sequence of illustrations that have a great deal of power in a sales interview. What are the things that make cash value life insurance so unique? There are really three of them. One of them is the policy death benefits go to beneficiaries without any income tax. Another one is the cash values accrue without income tax. And the third, and in a way the most valuable, at least for cash distributions, is the cash values can be accessed without income tax, either by withdrawals to basis or loans thereafter. Those three things in combination make the life insurance policy, cash value life insurance policy, extraordinarily unique, and makes what I'm going to show you as we go through this some more details. My name is Bob Ritter. I'm chairman and founder of InsMark, and I hope what I'm going to show you will be useful to you. Let's take a policy for George Baker. He's age 45. He's in a 35% income tax bracket. It's $500,000 of equity indexed universal life. It can be any type of cash value policy: universal life, whole life, variable universal. I'm going to use equity indexed in this example, but the principles that I'm going to show you will hold true no matter what type of policy you use. We're going to max fund this policy just short of it being a modified endowment contract, and I'm going to show annual premiums of $20,000 a year in years 1 through 20, and then at retirement we're going to show $75,000 a year in cash values being distributed via withdrawals to basis and loans thereafter for 20 retirement years. Most people make their best kinds of decisions in a comparative environment. Typical life insurance presentation of just the policy is more of a transaction, and you'll find, I think, if you compare the alternatives of spending that money elsewhere, your client will get a much better grasp on what it is you're showing him. Here's the policy with a quick summary of it. I'll show you the illustration in detail in a second, but we're going to pay $20,000 a year for 20 years, so over the first 20 years, that's $400,000. We're going to start drawing money out of the policy, and I've left enough cash values illustrated in the contract in the second from the last column that there's cash left over. We're not in risk of a policy crash. Take a look at the actual illustration. This is not your basic illustration that you do. It's the illustration from InsMark, a supplemental illustration. But there we are with the premiums and the cash values, no cash flow during pre-retirement years, building almost $1 million of cash value by retirement. And then in post-retirement years, you can see column 2 has entries of $75,000 a year, and those were created by withdrawals to basis, loans thereafter. And as you can see also at the ending years there in column 4, we still have $500,000 of cash value surrounded by $600,000 of death benefit. And I want to examine that policy for you in a variety of ways, comparing it to some alternatives. One way to gauge the efficiency of life insurance, particularly its death benefit, is to divide the policy's cumulative premiums by the year-by-year death benefit. This evaluates how many pennies of premium are required for each dollar of death benefit. This was Ben Feldman's, one of his great ideas, the great New York life salesman. And dollars of benefits for pennies of cost is a unique view of the life insurance death benefit. Let's see how this works for Dr. Baker. That's a $2 graph in this example. As you can see, the LI line for life insurance, that's the cost per penny for each dollar of death benefit. And it's interesting to note that during the accumulation years it rises slightly, and then during the tremendous efficiency of accessing cash values without income tax, the graph goes negative, so that over 40 years, which is about George's life expectancy, each dollar of death benefit delivered to his family is cost a negative 177 cents. To see that graphic, to see the illustration, column 1, this is similar to the other one really, but here's column 1 is the premium. Column 2, now we have a cumulative premium column. We're going to compare the death benefit to that column and find in column 4 the cost for funding each dollar of death benefit. Over the first 20 years, it hits a high of I guess in the 16th year, and then starts to turn a little bit. By the 20th year, each dollar of death benefit, in other words, the amount of money in the 5th column, that $918,000 in year 20 has cost George 28 cents for each dollar delivered to his family. But the interesting thing about this illustration is it then turns. As cash flow starts to come out of the policy and reduces the overall cumulative costs, that column 4 starts to reverse and ends up negative, so that at the end of the line there, each dollar delivered to the family is 177 cents, which is a pretty efficient way to purchase some death benefit. Now there was no foregone interest. The real cost of life insurance is what you could do with the money if you didn't buy the life insurance. So let's assume an 8% foregone interest. In other words, if George didn't buy the life insurance, he could invest the premiums at a pre-tax interest rate of, let's say, 8%, which is a pretty aggressive rate today, but that's the rate I'm showing on the crediting rate I'm showing on the policy, so let's use that. And as you can see, we still have a very effective column 5. We've got a new column here, though, in column 3, which is called effective cumulative payments. That's the cumulative in column 2 compounded up at the interest rate, I'm assuming. And when you do your comparison now, column 5, as you can see, doesn't even come close to $1. It hits the 50-cent dollar of death benefit in the 20th year. And again, you'll see that it turns. It turns a little later. As you run your eye down column 5, it turns a little later and still ends up with a negative cost of 114 cents for each dollar of death benefit. The magic number is 11.83. If we assume foregone interest on the premiums being spent of 11.83% of pre-tax equivalent, just finally at the end of 40 years, we hit the magic number of $1. So even if money could be invested at that rate, which is unlikely in this comparative environment, it takes 40 years for the dollar of cost to hit the dollar of death benefit. Again, 67 cents by the 20th year, and there's your dollar, just barely 0.1 cents. So it's a very effective measurement of death benefit using that illustration. Let's compare it to buying some term insurance, however. Term insurance premiums I'm going to illustrate for George are $800 for the first 20 years for an alternative $500,000 with a renewal rate of $4,000 a year in the second 20. Why, asks a critic, would you pay $20,000 for something you could get for $800? And the reason I want to show you this illustration and recommend strongly that you use it with your clients is that if that question gets asked of George when you're not there, he doesn't know how to answer it. If he visits his CPA, for instance, and the CPA, he shows the CPA this illustration, says, I'm thinking about acquiring this policy, and the CPA says, why would you pay $20,000 for something you could get for $800? George has no answer for that. It doesn't make sense. Let me show you why he should. Now, I'm going to use, again, 8% pre-tax use of money as an alternative funding mechanism on what we're going to call a side fund. So you're going to buy term and invest the difference. In my comparison here, we're going to assume an 80 basis point management fee, just slightly under 1%, at the same 35% tax bracket. So column 1, premiums net of the loans we're going to make. Column 2, the alternative premium cost. You can invest the difference, and if the difference were invested each and every year, column 3 you'd have column 3 values. Now, if buy term and invest the difference is a good idea, column 5 should be higher than column 3, and of course it isn't. Column 3 should be higher than column 5, and column 5 is the superior column, as you'll see in a second here. But let's take a look at a graph to show it to you. Green is good and red is not so hot. The cash values of the life insurance policy stay in the positive range. The cash values of do-it-yourself go into a negative range. And let's look at the actual illustration that we're using to do that. Here's the policy, the equity index policy. Here's the alternative term policy. Here's the amount George gets to invest every year. And if he does so at an 8% pre-tax equivalent, he'll have that amount of side fund values, which is nowhere near the amount of these cash values. It is in the early years, thanks to commissions. It takes about, in this case, 4, 5, 6 years, I guess, for the numbers to cross, using just cash value instead of a cum value, which is really the amount of money on which interest is being paid, but let's use cash values. And it starts to widen. And out in the second phase of this thing, in retirement years, not only does the side fund have to support $75,000 of withdrawal, after-tax withdrawal, it's got to also support the premium. So the side fund's got to produce this amount of money, and watch what happens to the side fund. It goes negative, which means at the end of the 40th year, George had better have another side fund he can get into the extent of a little over $1.1 million, or he's out of gas entirely on buy term invested difference. It really runs out of gas right here in the 29th year. But if you run it all the way out, he better have another side fund available. And the swing of values here long range is between a negative $1.1 million and a positive 500, which is $1,000,006 swing in favor of the cash value life insurance policy. We have a report on these illustrations called Matching Value, which shows the interest rate required on the side fund to match the policy values. George would have to earn 13.68% year in and year out on that difference of premium in order to match the values of the policy, which is a pretty interesting number. Now, what if Dr. Baker's advisor says, I don't think George needs coverage past 65? I suggested at 45 that's probably not a sensible thing to make a firm decision on, but let's follow the logic. Okay, we'll eliminate the term premiums and the term coverage after age 65. So my summary illustration here, if you look at column 2 for a second, is just the 800 for the first 20 years, 16,000, then freezing at 16,000. And of course, no death benefit after the 20th year either, because there's no term premium. And as you can see, column 3 still goes negative, not by as much, but still significantly negative compared to column 5, which still retains its 500,000 of long-range cash value. Graphically, it looks like that. Green still is good and red's getting worse. If we look at the illustration, obviously the first 20 years are going to be exactly the same because we're just doing the 800. Over in the next series of years, we have no term premium in column 2, and we have no death benefit in column 6, no term death benefit. And as you can see, here come the negatives as opposed to the values in the policy. And of course, there's no death benefit offsetting this either. This is a bad deal long range, even if you assume he won't pay premiums past that point. One last step, which is probably the cruncher. Some of our producers show just this one. Mr. Advisor, if Dr. Baker could purchase $500,000 of term life insurance for $1 a year, the cash value policy is a better choice. Now, this is all assuming that George has the cash value to buy what he wants. If he has no cash flow, he's short of money, and he needs the coverage, he may have to buy term. But assuming he has the cash flow to buy what he wants, if he could buy term insurance for $1 a year, it wouldn't make sense to do so. Let's examine why that might be. Column 2, there's your term premiums at $1 a year. All the difference invested in my side fund. Side fund values, column 3, still end up negative. A little less negative, but still a nasty negative as opposed to a $500,000 positive. And of course, the policy performs well in intervening years as well. Graphically, red is getting worse and green staying good. Now this one, it's an interesting illustration for those of us in the business because it's kind of odd to see that column 2 with just $1 in it. But even at that, over 10 years even, my policy's outperforming it. 15 years is starting to really spread. 20 years, 643 versus 918. But the magic happens in the second 20 when you keep the dollar going and keep the coverage going. We're assuming you could buy the $500,000 for 40 years for $1 a year. Still ends up with a negative 952 compared to $500,000. Just doesn't make any sense to consider term insurance in this environment. And that's why Dr. Baker ought to be buying permanent insurance rather than term insurance if he has the cash flow to buy what he wants. There's your graphs again. Top graph, term to age 85 comparison. Lower left, term to 65 comparison. Lower right, term for $1. But as we said, green is good and red is not so hot. What about other investment alternatives? Let's ignore the insurance entirely. How's the insurance stack up? Well, here's one for you. It's a module we have called Various Financial Alternatives. We're going to compare it to, in this case, 4 other alternatives. I think there's 17 possibles you could pick in the system, but let's pick these 4. CD at 4.5, Ginnie Mae Fund at 6, which is pretty aggressive today. Taxable junk bond fund at 8, and that is a very, very serious junk bond fund at that rate today. Tax-exempt unit trust at 4%. Same input and distribution pattern as the life policy. Column 1, values in the CD, end up negative. Column 2, values in the Ginnie Mae, end up negative. Column 3, values in the taxable bond fund, end up negative. Column 4, values in the tax-exempt unit trust, end up negative. Policy has $500,000 plus the death benefit surrounding it. So none of those appear to work very well. And this is really kind of interesting. The interest rate needed on each one of those to match the life policy's values, you need to have a CD earning over 11.5% to match the cash value. Ginnie Mae fund would have to earn over 12.5%. A taxable bond fund would have to earn over 13, and the unit trust would have to earn almost 8 in order to match those policy values. Those are out of range comparisons. This is a module that produces an illustration that looks like this. Pretty simple. Premium column 1, values developing in columns 2, 3, and 4. And as you can see, let's take the 10th year as a starter. 235, 239, 254, 243. Policy beats it by 284. I think it runs ahead in the 7th year. Down in here, 918. None of these other ones are close. And of course here it just runs away from it. If you produce 75,000 after tax coming out of those funds, you end up all negatives policy with a huge value. Graphic is interesting here as well. Shows it well. Excuse me, those are the matching values numbers that I talked about a minute ago. But the graphic is interesting. Same net payment schedule. Cash values on the upper right, death benefit on the upper right compared to those. Someone once said it's better to be rich and healthy than poor and sick, and this is certainly an example of the advantages of this life insurance policy in this context. Okay, let's really stretch it. Let's measure this against an all-equity account. Give no value to the fact there's life insurance death benefit, which of course has value, but let's ignore it. Let's see whether this thing can compare cash on cash with equities. One of the interesting things about an equity account is if you count all of the features that retard the growth of an equity account, the growth isn't nearly what you think it might be. If you check, the only thing that retards the growth on say, for example, an equity index policy, life insurance policy, is the mortality charges. But if you take the same yield on an equity account, you've got management fees, you've got income tax on short-term turnover, you have capital gains tax on long-term turnover. There's a lot of things that can nip at the growth of an equity account. In this example, I'm going to use an equity account at 7% growth, 1% dividend to get the same 8% comparison to the policy. I'm going to assume 70 basis points of a management fee, very, very conservative, just under a 1 percentage point. Typically, it would be 1 or more. Same 35% income tax bracket, 30% portfolio turnover, capital gains tax, 70% long-term, 30% short-term. That's not said properly. Capital subject to long-term capital gains is 70. 30% of it will be short-term. So it'll be 70% long-term gains, 30% short-term gains, which is really kind of unusual. It's very favorable for long-term. But here you go. Run your cumulative investment in your equity account down column 1, 20,000 a year for 20 years. Then start pulling the money out. Read that column a little bit. Cum after-tax retirement distributions, 75,000 a year starting in year 21. And you notice the equity account, the yellow print underneath column 3, 4, and 5. The equity account runs out of money in year 34. The life insurance policy does not, and is illustrated to produce $1.5 million in after-tax retirement cash flow with $500,000 in residual value. The graphs are obvious just by their size. The policy is so much more a better option for Dr. Baker. But let's look at the actual illustrations here for a minute. Now, run across the top here for a second with me. We have no initial values in the equity. We're just going to put in 20 a year. So obviously there's no starting cost basis. I've got growth rate of 7 and a dividend rate of 1. I've got a dividend tax rate here of 15% for a few years and 35. Who knows what Congress is going to do to the interest rates? I think we're going to see a spike here, however. I've got a pre-tax retirement tax bracket of 35%, and I got a composite capital gains tax rate, which is an odd combination of some short-term, some long-term. Capital gains low now, probably going up a little bit. Read this with me just for a second. The composite capital gains tax rate includes 30% short-term gains subject to ordinary income and 70% long-term gains subject to capital gains tax. The individual tax rates used to compute this composite tax rate are capital gains 15 years, 1 to 4, 20% thereafter, and of course the income tax rate of 35%. So that is an accurate composite, at least under the assumptions that we used. So let's watch what that account does. Over 20 years, it builds $757,000, not taking any money out of it, reinvesting the capital growth after tax, reinvesting the after-tax dividends. And then this is the surprising thing. As we start to take money out of the policy, we'll sell a certain amount of equities, still have some capital growth. We're taking dividends now as part of our distributions. And if you jumble all those numbers together, you end up with column 8, which is a $75,000 after-tax distribution, which taps out in year 14 of retirement, 7 years short of George's age 80. Life policy still continues in this environment as opposed to the equity account. It's a superior choice using these assumptions, which I think are pretty straightforward. There's nothing smoky going on here. These are real calcs. Now, to my knowledge, we're the only software company in America that does turnover calculations, and the average mutual fund last year turned over at over 100%, well over 150%. And when that happens, that's when you get those end-of-year tax statements, when even though you might have had a loss in your mutual fund, you've got taxable gains. That's what causes that. And I've used a very conservative portfolio turnover assumption here. These are, I'm not going to spend any time on these. I just want you to know we do it. We actually give you the details of the portfolio turnover calcs. Oops, I just lost something there. And this is a jumble of numbers. It reads just like a book. If you want to take the time to do it, why, we would be glad to forward on this illustration to you, or do it if you happen to have the system yourself. But that's the pre-retirement, and there's the post-retirement. Those numbers are all backed up by solid. Those are solid numbers. Buy term and invested difference? I don't think so. There is no valid economic theory that explains why a bad idea is acceptable simply because one hears it frequently. And we certainly do hear it frequently, particularly from the financial press that has never taken the time to do this kind of comparative analysis. They deal in the logic of why would you pay $20,000 for something you can get for $800, and until you get inside the numbers, it's hard sometimes to determine why you'd want to do that. But there is no theory that explains why a bad idea is a good one just because you hear it a lot. And Will Rogers once said, it's not ignorance that's so bad, it's all the things we know that ain't so. The truth of the matter is, if the cash flow exists to buy what you want, the cash value policy is the only logical choice, for certain. Now, for those that have the InsMark Illustration System, let me show you the illustrations that I used to do this presentation. Under the Personal Insurance tab in that system, I first used the number 1, I used the illustration of values. Then I used dollars of benefits for pennies of cost. Then I used term and invested difference. Then I used various financial alternatives. And then for the equity account, I went into the InsCalc tab and picked up the equity account calculator, which there's several calculators in there. I just happened to show you the equity account calculator. So remember also, the policy loans reduce policy cash values and death benefits, and the lapse of a loan policy can result in a bad tax bill. So you want to be sure not to run those values down too close to zero. And you might want to consult a tax advisor if you had any question about this. For those of you who aren't licensed and would like to have information about it, contact an InsMark account executive at 1-888-InsMark. We'd love to talk to you about it. And thanks for taking the time to listen to this presentation.